Fantastic. Well, good morning to you all. Thanks very much for joining us and joining us for this informative session where we're going to be walking through and talking through HR's role in avoiding employee burnout. This is live, so I do feel a bit like a Saturday night host, but it's Thursday, the 18th of September. It's 11 o'clock. And so, like I said, we appreciate you all joining us this morning. We encourage questions throughout today's session. So just by way of navigation, you should see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's the ability to have a chat function to ask some questions in there. And we've got the moderators on standby, so they'll pick up those questions and send them through to ourselves when we do Q&A a bit later on in the session. So by way of introduction, my name is Chris Groome. I'm head of sales over at Access in the People division. I've been in this space for a number of years, work with organisations just like yourselves, to really uncover the pains of the world of HR and how technology can help foster a better environment. But I'm also joined by my colleague, over 10 years of progressive HR leadership experience across a diverse background with a real flair for understanding your workforces. So Amy, our Global Rewards Director here at Access, welcome. Thanks very much for joining. And I hope you like that intro. Smashing. So if we move forward to the agenda for today, so we're going to go through some great topics. So we'll look at the burnout risk in 2025 and talk through some of our studies and industry research that we have alongside kind of what you need to know or what would empower you within your organisation. After some of those slides and hearing my voice, we'll move over to Amy and really using and fostering that knowledge of the HR world and environment across a number of organisations, look at how we can spot and prevent burnout amongst our workforce. And then at the latter stage of today's session, we'll have Q&A, hopefully with some of your great questions and also a fireside chat with some really thought-provoking topics to go through. So that's the agenda set out. And what I thought would be great is to kick off today with a bit of a poll. So hopefully our adjudicators will pass us through. So this is not Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It's not fastest finger first, but you'll see pop up on your screen now how confident you feel right now about managing burnout in your business. And we'll sort of see how those scores come through. So I'll give it a couple of minutes just as everything flows through, but it really gives us a good direction for the understanding of where you guys are at right now, but also where we could get to. And we have a typical expectation that the majority of our audience today will fit somewhere between number 2 and number 3, somewhat confident. And this is not very, but learning confidence, I would say. And we can see now as the votes come in that we are very much in that somewhat confident area. So we'll continue to monitor that. If there's anybody else the poll's popping up on that hasn't pressed it yet, please feel free to do so. And that'll really help us understand where you're at as an organisation. Okay. So let's kick off with what HR needs to know about the burnout risk in 2025. So if the adjudicator can just take me through to the next slide, that'd be great. So start off with talking about 4 key areas about the real cost to your organisation or to business. So the numbers tell a story that demands attention. It demands attention not just of you as HR professionals, but also of your senior leadership team. So if we look at these 4 stats, and we'll start with retention. So when employees burn out, they don't just disengage. They actually use their feet and leave the organisation. Gallup research told us that burnt out employees are 2.6 times more likely to seek a different job than stay within the organisation. Now, if you think about what that means to you and to your business and the teams that you look after right now, every burnt out employee in your team is essentially a foot out the door before you're even aware of the problem. When they leave your organisation, you don't just lose them as an individual. You lose their knowledge of you as an organisation, the knowledge of the marketplace that you operate in. You lose the relationships with them, with the workforce and with you, but also the relationships with your client base. And it also impacts the team cohesion. Now, on top of that, you've also got perhaps hidden costs or visible costs, depending on how you look at it, recruitment, onboarding, getting somebody up to speed that may come in and take that role instead. And that also leads to a great dip in productivity. So there's a real impact there that we need to think about and consider. Then there's the absence problem. So the bottom left on your screen. Burnout doesn't wait for convenient timing. And I would love for things to be a little bit more convenient, but they never are. Gallup found 63% of burnt out employees are more likely to take sick days. Now, if you think about your workforce and think about a proportion that may already be burnt out or be burning out, 2/3 calling in sick more frequently. These aren't just numbers on spreadsheets. These are your real workforce that you're having to deal with. And when they're out, what happens? What is the impact on those that are still within your organization? Projects may fall behind. Teammates have to scramble for projects or deadlines to cover, to wear multiple hats. It really has a compounding impact upon everybody, not just those that are burnt out. Now, there's a study called On Fire or Fizzling Out. And if you haven't read it, I'd really encourage you to read it. It's quite insightful. But they came out with a statement that said, when burnt out employees show up, are they really there? So that study, one of the key things that study found was there is a dip of a staggering 23% in productivity amongst those that are feeling burnt out. My mum would always say, the lights are on, but no one's home. But the kind of dynamic of what you think is they're there in the workplace, but actually what they're doing is it enough? Is it what they're used to? And is it noticed? So if you imagine right now, you can run your business on a quarter less output because of the affected employees. What does that mean? What is the impact? The other thing to think about strategically is what the business misses: missed opportunities, slower response times, diminished quality, and the impact that has on the overall business. As well, at the same time, you're still paying that employee their full salary. And that ties into the bottom line. Hogan studied and looked at the cost in businesses to the bottom line of a burnt out employee, and this is per employee. And the study found that on average, it costs an organisation £10,000. So multiply that by the number of people you may have in your organisation, and the number becomes quite staggering. And so compounding these four things, the cost of the business is no longer just an HR issue to deal with within your sort of field. It's a fundamental business risk. And so the question isn't whether you can afford to address burnout, it's whether actually you can afford not to address burnout. And if we move to the next slide, why this matters now. So there are a number of things going on in the world, right? And we can talk through sort of four quadrants here in our presentation. So economic uncertainty and inflation. Now, I'm expecting to see a notification from BBC News any minute about what the interest rate's going to be, or if they're going to leave it as it is, and the impact that has to me as an individual. But I'm sure there's some business leaders here right now thinking, what impact does it have to my organisation and my workforce? There's some other things like the national insurance increase more recently. The business had to bear that cost to ensure that their workforce are adequately and appropriately paid, but somewhere that has an impact. Now, when you think about your workforce, living costs are increasing, wage stagnation in the majority, and employees are feeling a compound pressure or environment to work longer hours or take on additional roles to maintain the standard of living that they're used to. The uncertainty in the economy also drives a level of insecurity about job safety. So people and employees are accepting higher levels of workload because they don't want to feel like their role is at risk, that their role within the business isn't necessary. And we compound that with, from a business perspective, so we're looking at our bottom line as a business leader, we need to be lean, or we're trying to be efficient so that our rate of profitability or being able to sustain the business for the long term is also there. So these are sort of compounding factors. And sometimes as industry leaders or as HR professionals, we don't actually see that larger picture of how an employee can perceive it. And that consistently and constantly creates a cycle where individuals are absorbing the pressures because they have a fear. Now, to the right, the rise of remote and hybrid working. Right now, it's pretty obvious I'm not in an office. I'm actually in the back half of my garage. My wife tells me I should live out here sometimes. But post-pandemic, we've come into a world where remote and hybrid working is really quite an acceptable norm. And whilst offering a lot of flexibility, what remote working has done subconsciously is eliminated the boundary of going to the office, of a working timeline. So the reality is the home office never closes. And if you think about some of your workforce that you might be talking to, their home office or where they work from might be the kitchen table. It might be a desk in the spare room or, in a kid's bedroom because they're not there during the day. So the ability for them to turn off and separate becomes harder than it's ever been before. What it also means is the extended working hours, the difficulty to switch off. We have, ironically, because we are on a webinar, video call fatigue. I don't know how much time I spend on Teams in a day, but I can tell you it's quite a lot. And then there's the other things. I don't have a water cooler. Now, water cooler is a very American term for sure, but that ability to go get a cup of tea and at the same time you're seeing colleagues and friends, you're not necessarily talking about work, you're just having social interaction. Now, beyond my dog, who's probably sick to death of me talking to him, I don't have social interaction outside of my sort of home office hybrid working, right? So it creates different levels of stress, which we may not have had before, but we also might not be experienced in how to appropriately deal with it and look after our workforce. The pace of technological change is a big one, and I'm going to talk about this a couple of times as we move through the slides. But we are constantly seeing upgrades to the tech we use, new digital tools, evolving work processes, AI. What AI can bring to our organizations, to our daily lives, to what we do as tasks is phenomenal. But it also has that impact on those that perhaps are not so forthcoming in the adoption. And we have to learn all this and take all this on top of our daily tasks, on top of our daily roles. And a lot of employees and studies show that there's so much anxiety around keeping up with technology and the impact that new technology brings to our roles. The expectation that is set, whether that be deliberately or deliberately or not deliberately, is that we should embrace and just understand this tech straight away. And so that, again, is a compounding factor upon the workforce as to how do we understand it, how do we use it? And there's a lot of things about also impacting focused time because there's so much going on. And then finally, in the bottom right quadrant, and again, I'll touch on this a bit more in some future slides, within organizations similar to you and similar to your size, we often see that there lacks to be dedicated support and resources for the workforce. So we think about that in terms of you're wearing multiple hats within an HR function. Do you have employee assistance programs, comprehensive wellbeing initiatives? Employers in small organizations are doing multiple things to help the business grow or to help the business sustain. And that can lead to chronic stress, ambiguity, pressures that we don't necessarily always see. So if you move to the next slide, thank you very much, guys. So workload is very much the tip of the iceberg. We talked a little bit there in the previous slide about within an SME type of organization, the resource constraints. Whether we like it or not, employees are feeling like they need to do more, but potentially with less. So it's not just about being lean with the headcount and lean inefficiencies in the business, but we are expecting to maintain and supersede the quality and levels that we deliver, but potentially with less things to do it. And again, that preys on the workforce. The digital overwhelm, the always-on culture. If I told you that today, between you clocking on and clocking off, you probably receive 120 emails, I think the majority of you would probably agree. Now, if I also told you that on average, every 20 seconds, you change what you're doing, so that be looking at Teams, looking at emails, looking at the task or whatever, you'd probably say, well, that doesn't quite sound right. But the studies show that is what happens to the average employee. 120 emails, and they are distracted or changing between applications every 20 seconds. So we're working longer, we're trying to do more, wear multiple hats, we're feeding 120 emails, we're changing tasks every 20 seconds. We live in a world of constant interruption. Not to mention if you're hybrid working or home working and there's kids, pets, postmen, or anything else in the background. And that constant interruption can lead to fragmentation within our employees and within our workforce. The other piece with the digital always-on culture is that we've come into this world where we expect instant responses. If I message you on Teams, I expect you to respond. Now, previously, if we're in a working environment in an office or something like that, you'd look across, you can see someone's on a call, you can see someone's in a meeting, you'd wait, and it'd be naturally acceptable to wait. And so that real dynamic shift has occurred in our workforces. And we need to be really aware of that, because what happens, or what the byproduct of that is that there's less downtime, less time for creative thinking, because we're always working, and that can really impact your workforce. Now, lack of autonomy and control, I find this one is a bit contentious because it can go both ways. As we are in a place of economic turbulence, shall we say, and that we're running our businesses lean or more efficient, there can be a place where leadership is more involved in the daily tasks because they want to maintain control, but maintain that we can get the best and the most out of what we're doing whilst we're running in a lean environment. The flip reverse could also be with hybrid working, actually there is a gain in autonomy. So I think that one works both ways, but it's really a point that you should look at within your organization. And it ties and connects really well with unclear expectations. That again, we can be in a place where someone takes on multiple tasks, takes on multiple hats, is doing more than they really should do because they're conscious about their job security. Does that damage or does that impact the expectation we have for the role that we want them to do? And therefore, does that connect with burnout? And the combination of all these things leads to an impact on psychological safety. Do I, as an employee, feel safe telling you, my employer, or telling you, my HR team, that I have a challenge or a concern about what I'm doing? Because is my job safe? Have I taken on enough to be seen that I'm doing everything I possibly can and I'm the model employee? And there's a real impact with burnout there, that employees don't feel they can be vulnerable to their leaders because it may expose them to something. If we are in an environment where that is true, you can really see how burnout can multiply within those individuals and why it's an area of concern. So if we move to the next slide, thank you very much. So the reality is we are all facing our unique challenges, but with common threads within our businesses. And organizations of your size typically see bigger impacts because the removal or the change in some of the workforce because of burnout, because they're taking some time out or sick leave or anything like that, can have a larger impact. Now, I've spent years talking about the fact that HR need to and should have a strategic place within the leadership of the business, a seat on the board of directors and so on. What we often find in our experience with working with organizations like your size and Staff Chair, is that there is a limitation in HR resource. And there's a limitation also in the budget you're given to carry out your tasks and be as pro-efficient as you can and embrace technology like Access PeopleHR to really help you foster and understand the workforce and have everything at your fingertips. Like I was already saying, the higher impact when key people burn out and step out and the impact that they can have. The less formal support structures, because it's not necessarily always felt like it's a strategic need for the business, but now more than ever before it is. And then the multiple responsibilities. Like, how many hats are you wearing today in the job that you're doing right now? The fact you've taken time to spend time with us today is fantastic. But how's that impacted the rest of your workload for today? You know, and we're seeing it more and more and more in the organizations we talk to and work with. So that's a snapshot of what we see and how we understand it. And that's great coming from me. But I am not the HR professional with decades of experience. Amy is. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Amy in what role HR can play in understanding burnout.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And that's really insightful. And I think what it does is it gives us the metrics, the commercial impact, so that we can have those credible conversations with our business leaders, right? And that's where we need to be coming from. So given these complex interconnected drivers of burnout, how then can we as HR professionals respond strategically, right? So looking at coming away from reaction and seeing what we can do proactively to predict burnout before it happens. So if we can move to the next slide. So when thinking about this, I think we need a 4-pillar approach that addresses both the symptoms and then also the underlying causes. So the first one is early detection, spotting what others miss. So traditional management relies on employees self-reporting their stress or managers noticing obvious performance drops. But research shows that this misses critical early indicators. And when employees feel they can't be vulnerable with leaders, we need to rely on behavioural data that reveals stress patterns before individuals actually recognise or admit them. And early detection means identifying the employee whose work patterns might have shifted. Perhaps they're sending emails at increasingly unusual hours, or their meeting participation has declined, or their Bradford factor is trending upward. We're looking for pattern changes that suggest someone is struggling with resource constraints or unclear expectations before they burn out completely. The second pillar is data-driven insights. So let's make sense of the complexity around this. And like I said, it's multifaceted. There are multiple drivers creating burnout. So that the digital overwhelm that Chris was talking to, lack of autonomy, and we need sophisticated analysis to actually understand what's happening in our organizations so that we can have that voice at the leadership table, and so that we can enable and partner with our leadership teams effectively and credibly. Data helps us separate correlation from causation. And then it also identifies which interventions are actually working, because we have that data and we can look at those patterns. So, for instance, absence patterns might reveal that certain teams consistently struggle during specific project phases. And then you're looking at resource constraints, or performance review trends could highlight where have been unclear, and that's creating that chronic stress. Or digital behavior analytics can show us where our always-on culture is then taking its toll through after-hours activity patterns. So starting to understand that. And the key is using data not just to spot individual risk, but to understand systemic problems. Are we seeing burnout clustered in particular departments or at particular management levels, in our IC population, particular project or program types? And that insight then helps us address the root causes, not just reacting to individual cases. The third pillar is addressing your operating model. So this pillar directly tackles the core drivers that we've identified. So the resource constraints, the digital overwhelm, lack of autonomy. But it's not just about improving HR's operating model. It's about HR, us as professionals, partnering with the business to lead a comprehensive review of how each department, each function, each team actually operates on a day-to-day basis. And we need to examine their workflows, ask them fundamental questions. So what work genuinely in that workflow adds value to customers or business outcomes? What tasks exist simply because that's how we've always done it? I bet we've all heard that before. And where are people spending time on activities that could be automated or eliminated or simplified? And with the increase in AI usage as well, how can we utilize AI to reduce the level of administration or operational tasks they're spending on? So, for example, in the sales function, how much time are your account managers spending on CRM data entry versus actual customer interaction? In finance, what percentage of an analyst's time goes to manual reporting that could be automated? And in operations, which approval processes genuinely add control versus creating those bureaucratic delays? And the goal is identifying where technology can actually eliminate that or automate that low value work entirely, not just digitizing existing inefficient processes. And this means working with the department heads, right? So this isn't our role to create, it's our role to lead and partner and ask those challenging questions. So it's partnering with them to map their current workflows, identifying those bottlenecks, looking at the time wasting, and then redesigning those processes in your operating model around what humans do best and automate everything else. And HR's role becomes that of this internal consultant. So partnering with those functions, stripping out unnecessary complexity, reducing that cognitive load, and giving employees back time for meaningful and high impact work. So when someone's job involves 60% administrative tasks and 40% strategic thinking, we need to flip that ratio through intelligent process redesign. So this approach directly addresses the resource constraint issue by creating that genuine capacity rather than just asking or expecting people to work longer hours. And then the fourth pillar is cultural shift, right? So creating that psychological safety and sustainable performance. And this perhaps is the most crucial pillar because it does address that psychological safety deficit that prevents early intervention. So a culture shift means moving away from rewarding the person who is working that 70-hour week to recognizing sustainable high performance. And it means training managers to have supportive conversations about workload and stress rather than assuming employees will self-advocate. And most importantly, it means creating an environment where employees feel safe to be honest about their capacity and honest about the challenges that they're facing without having direct career consequences as a result of that conversation. So when people feel safe to say, I'm struggling with this workload, or I don't understand what success looks like here, we can intervene before burnout occurs. But we have to make sure that our leaders are responding and reacting to that conversation in the right way. And this cultural transformation is what makes the other three pillars effective. Without psychological safety, early detection systems only capture what people are willing to reveal. Data insights remain somewhat theoretical. And then operating model improvements will be undermined by old behaviors or legacy behaviors that you see within your organization. So this brings you with the integration challenge. They have to work together. These four pillars must come together. Data without culture change becomes surveillance. Technology without a clear purpose adds to that digital overwhelm, and early detection without supportive culture creates anxiety rather than relief. But when they're integrated effectively, they create a proactive system that then addresses both individual risk and the systemic causes of workplace burnout. So we can go to the next slide. So how does this then translate into practical action? So I've got three concrete areas where you can start immediately. So those early warning signs that managers miss. So managers are brilliant at spotting dramatic changes. The employee who suddenly stops contributing in meetings or takes a week off, but they consistently miss those gradual patterns that precede the crisis. So performance drops aren't sudden failures. They're subtle declines over months. And an employee who's historically delivered exceptional work now consistently produces adequate results. So managers see someone who's coasting or lost motivation, but data can reveal someone whose capacity is being overwhelmed and where we're seeing signs of burnout. Absence patterns, they tell stories that individual sick days do not. So the shift from random absence to then concentrated Monday to Friday patterns could suggest someone's using weekends for recovery, but they're still struggling. Or increased short-term absences often precede longer stress-related leave. But here's what surprised us the most. Excessive hours actually often indicate struggling, not dedication. And employees working significantly beyond their contracted hours may be compensating for reduced efficiency due to stress. And I think Chris was mentioning this earlier. So it's not demonstrating commitment, it's demonstrating overwhelm. And managers praise that dedicated employee staying late every night, but they're missing that burnout warning sign. So the data can really reveal elements that these reactive assessments can't. Secondly, use your people data. So if you already collect this information, the challenge is then connecting the dots systematically rather than using that data reactively. So absence heat maps, for example, reveal patterns across teams, departments, and time periods that individual case management can't. Which teams consistently are showing higher absence during specific project phases? Where do we see clusters of stress-related leave? Yale-Bradford factor scoring becomes predictive when tracked as trends. So an employee moving from a score of 10 to 40 over 6 months tells a story, even if their absolute score isn't yet concerning to you. And we're looking for trajectory, not just position, so that we can then intervene rather than react. And then performance review trends as well are particularly powerful when analysed individually over time. So a high performer dropping to average performance represents a bigger risk signal than someone who is maintaining consistent average ratings. So it's the change is what that matters, and it's the subtle changes and the visibility of those subtle changes that's really powerful. And then lastly, AI and automation angle within HR. We can't get away with a conversation around HR without talking about AI, right? And this isn't about replacing human judgment. It's about enhancing our ability as HR professionals to spot patterns that humans just naturally miss. And then it frees up our time for more meaningful intervention. So AI can analyze combinations of factors that predict risk. So those specific absence patterns combined with performance trends and workload data or capacity plans. And it can do this with the accuracy that far exceeds, definitely mine, but any individual factor analysis, right? So it can be very powerful, but more importantly, it flags people for supportive conversation, not disciplinary action. And the human element then steps in. So it enhances our ability and it supports us to do even better in our job as HR professionals. The automation angle within HR is crucial as well for sustainability. So technology should eliminate those routine tasks so that we can then focus on the human conversations and interventions that then prevent that burnout. And the goal is creating that capacity for relationship building and partnering work, the interactions with your senior leadership team or your board that technology just can't do. And we can let technology handle all of that pattern recognition and data analysis that humans struggle with and get on with what we do best. So I think that's all from me in terms of giving you my thoughts, my 2 pennies on how we can tackle this. And then I think, Chris, you and I are now having a bit of a fireside chat.
That's right, yes. Fireside chat without fireside, but a chat nonetheless. So, thank you very much for sharing your insight, and hopefully all those that are watching found that quite informative. I've got a couple of challenging questions for you, actually, that I was pondering whilst you were speaking. So, we've gone through a lot of data, and you're really sort of talking about some of the compelling data and discussion points on identifying burnout early, and then sort of what the impact is and what happens. What I'm really curious to know is if the data reveals that burnout is actually being caused by senior leadership and their behaviours or their unrealistic business targets or goals, how would you navigate the conversation with the very people who might actually be the people creating the problem?
Yeah, I think you've probably just asked a question that a lot of people might have on their minds in the HR profession, and it's absolutely the most challenging aspect of implementing this type of approach. And I won't pretend it's easy, but what I've learned is that data gives you the courage and the credibility to have a robust and sometimes difficult conversation. So when you can present objective evidence, so I'm showing that team A under manager X has a 40% higher absence rate, or that departments with certain leadership styles consistently show poor or declining engagement scores, it shifts the conversation from opinion to fact. And leaders can or tend to dismiss sometimes anecdotal feedback, but it's difficult to argue with patterns in their own data. So my approach is to frame it as a business risk rather than a personal criticism. I'll say that, I'll say the data suggests this department is at high risk of talent loss and productivity decline. And I'm always connecting it back as well to the commercial impact, speak their language. So if you're talking to a leader in sales versus a leader in P&E versus a leader in finance, you need to adapt the way that you're connecting with them. And then also, what support do they then need from me as their business partner to address that, rather than accusatory, you're causing burnout in your team. So it's going in with those facts. And sometimes the answer absolutely is leadership development. Sometimes it's workload rebalancing. Sometimes it's honest conversations about unrealistic target. And I mentioned the operating model piece as well. So having those courageous conversations with your leaders to say, let's look at our workflow and let's look at the key points within that workflow and see if we can make this any more efficient than it is, start to remove that administrative burden from people. So then you're starting to talk their language and you're starting to really enable them and partner with them. And the key here is positioning yourself as a HR leader as a strategic partner, and you're helping them succeed. We are not critics pointing out their failures. But I'll be honest as well, if senior leadership consistently refuses to address systemic issues that your data is revealing, then you might feel like you're fighting a losing battle. And at that point, it does then become about protecting individual employees where you can, and then escalating that risk accordingly to even more senior leadership.
Yeah, no, cool. No, thank you for answering that. And obviously, anyone in the audience, we can extend this conversation right now. So if you have any questions on handling that with senior leadership, then do pop them in the chat, and we'll pick those up. And I was quite interested in some of the things you're talking about, the data, right? We can use that data because it empowers the conversation. But if I flip it back now as an employee, a lot of what we talked about, we can monitor digital behavior, we can track absence patterns, performance patterns. In your experience, how do you balance early intervention with employee privacy concerns? Because how do we safeguard the environment and the workforce to ensure it doesn't feel like HR's watching their every move and monitoring it?
Yeah, and no HR team wants to be perceived like that ever. So you've identified a really critical implementation risk. If the employees perceive this as surveillance, it destroys the trust necessary for it to actually work effectively. So your approach needs to start with transparency. So explaining what data we're using, why we're tracking these types of patterns, and really importantly, what actions we'll take as well. So employees know that early warning flags lead to supportive conversations, not disciplinary action. That's what we're aiming for. And I found in the past, when people understand that the intent is to help and support, that we're not monitoring for punishment, acceptance increases dramatically. And you could also involve employee representatives, for example, in designing that approach. So what data points feel invasive versus helpful? What would help employees trust the process? And again, this hits back on the culture of your organization and working with your organization to build stuff like this so that it lands in the right way. And practically as well, like looking at the data, my recommendation is focusing on pattern analysis rather than individual monitoring. So we're not reading emails or tracking keystrokes. We are looking at metadata patterns that then indicate stress without revealing any personal information. And there has to be strict protocols about who can then access what data and under what circumstances as well. But more importantly, you have to be transparent about what we can't promise, right? So this is equally as important. If the data reveals serious performance or conduct issues, we can't ignore that as HR professionals. It's the reality of the job. The key is being upfront about boundaries, whilst then emphasizing the primary purpose, which is employee support, not performance management. So the measure of success with this is whether employees eventually come to us proactively when they're struggling, rather than us having to detect it within teams through data. And that's when you know the trust is working.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it kind of leads back, I guess, to what we've talked about before with the psychological safety, right? In actually making the workforce aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it and what it means to them. So you create that right environment where they feel safe, that they can share with you how they're feeling.
Absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. So I've got one more question, and then we'll go over to the audience. So we've talked a lot about how technology and data, and there's a common thread here as a technology provider, can solve some of these challenges, but fundamentally it still feels to me like this is a human problem. If an employee is burnt out because they feel undervalued or overworked, or they've got a challenging manager, I guess the word is toxic, but I don't necessarily want to say that, a challenging manager, will the predictive analytics and kind of the patterns that we see actually solve that? Are we in a place where we're managing symptoms but not the underlying causes, and they kind of still remain? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental tension, and you're right to challenge it. Data-driven approaches can become sophisticated ways of managing the symptoms and avoiding hard organizational changes. They can. But I'd argue that good data used in the right way actually forces you to confront the root causes rather than ignoring them. So when your analysis consistently shows that certain managers, working patterns, or organizational structures correlate with burnout, you can't pretend individual resilience training is going to solve that problem. And the key is using data diagnostically, not just reactively. So yes, we identify individuals at risk and we provide support, but more importantly, we're identifying systemic patterns that reveal where our organization is broken, and where we need to intervene, and where we need to support, enable, fix, change. And if the data shows that, for example, everyone working on project X develops stress indicators, the solution isn't better stress management for those individuals. It's redesigning how we're approaching project management or project X specifically. If certain management styles consistently correlate with team burnout, then the answer is leadership development or management changes. It's not just supporting the affected employee. But look, I completely acknowledge the limitation. Data can tell you what's happening and where, and this is where, the 4 pillars that I talked through, they have to work in conjunction together. Because if leadership and the culture of your organization isn't ready or prepared to address, toxic behaviors within managers, unrealistic deadlines that are being set, unrealistic targets being set, or resource constraints that the data is revealing, then yes, you're just going to get really, really good at using your data to manage the casualties. And that's why that 4th pillar, that the cultural shift, is essential. Without leadership commitment to act on what the data reveals about the organization and the problems it has, then the whole approach becomes a very expensive way of documenting dysfunction rather than solving it. And this is why it's so important that HR has a voice at the leadership table. And the only way that voice can be credible and impactful and meaningful is if we can use concrete data to tell a story that starts to plant those seeds and starts to change that perception by your senior leadership. And the honest answer is that data-driven burnout prevention will only work if your organization is genuinely committed to changing the conditions that create burnout. And that is our job as well, is to create that story, to create that buy-in, and help them understand the impact, both on their employees, the engagement of the company, but also the commercial impact as well that they need to be aware of.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you. We appreciate you sharing a lot of your experience and advice with the audience on some of those hot topics. I'm conscious of everybody's time, so we're going to throw it over to the audience questions. I've got one here that I'll read out, and if you don't mind, Amy, just answering back on that. So we have a member who is part of a small HR team, often wearing multiple hats. And I think we covered that off a couple of times in the presentation. They feel like they lack a lot of time to prioritize. So on the basis of what we talked about today, what would be the top 1 or 2 metrics or warning signs to look out for to identify burnt out or burning out employees?
Yeah, so you could use your if you haven't heard about it before, your Bradford factor. So your Bradford factor is a measure it measures the impact of employee absence patterns, and the key insight is from the Bradford factor is that short absences are going to be more disruptive to business operations than fewer longer absences. So someone taking 10 single sick days creates more operational challenges than someone taking, for example, 1 10-day period off sick. So you could use your Bradford factor, and then with your absence patterns, then also you can start to look at your engagement scores across the business. You can start to look at your performance metrics across the business. So where you were typically seeing teams with high performance, if you're starting to gradually see a reduction in that performance, then that's where you start to intervene and start to have those discussions with your leadership beforehand. So those are probably the 3 metrics that I would focus on if you're struggling with time.
Awesome, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question, but I think some really good things to go away and think about within the organisation as to what you can use to prioritise your time. So going back to our potentially toxic managers, but also our managers who may not see well-being as part of their job. In your experience, how do you get buy-in from managers?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 factors in this. It starts at the top. So there's a reason your manager doesn't think that well-being is their responsibility, and it's because their leader hasn't made it their responsibility or a priority in their role. I think it starts from the very beginning when you are hiring or internally promoting someone. So you'll see that, a lot of managers come from exceptional individual contributors. What we fail to challenge in a meaningful way is whether that individual contributor has the right leadership behaviors that will then constitute a great leader. They are 2 separate skill sets. Yeah. And so identifying that in the interview process and challenging your leadership team on that interview process to ensure that you have the right people that can galvanize those teams, that can look after those teams' well-being, that care about the team's well-being, as well as the commercial performance. So it absolutely is their job to bring the revenue into the company. It's also their job to make sure that they have a high-performing and engaged team. If they're not engaged, if their well-being's there, then they're not engaged. If they're not engaged, you're not going to see commercial results. So it's helping them with that line of sight from well-being to their commercial results to first get their buy-in. But I would hope that when you're in the interview process, you're also assessing the behaviors that align with the culture that your organization wants to create. So they're probably my 2 pieces of advice with leaders or toxic managers that doesn't think that well-being is their problem. It is really in how you assess them in the first place, and then also how you measure them. So think about if they have bonuses, quarterly reviews, annual reviews, how are you bringing the leadership component into their objectives? Is it mandatory in your company that every leader has to have people metrics in their KPIs? And if they don't hit those people metrics, then they're not going to hit their target 100%. So start to build it in so that there is real accountability and consequence if they're not looking after their employees and they're not seeing engagement from their employees. And again, that's where data insights can really help you with. So, for example, engagement scores within your company, it could be a very simple employee NPS to start to measure how engaged employees are feeling in each of the teams. And it doesn't mean to say that we can't partner with the business, right? I partner with, so I look after reward, and I'm also a business partner to our chief sales officer as well. And I partner with him on engagement. Doesn't mean I have all the answers, but I can consult and I can coach them through and ask them the right questions. And then I can help them with implementation as well across the business.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that insight. I think there's a few different areas that we can definitely be addressing in our organisations to encourage those leaders who might not see it top of their list. We've only got time for one more question, but there's actually two that are fairly similar. So I'll kind of blend the two together. So in a smaller organisation, so we've got an example here, one person asking about a 50 employee organisation, another person in a similar sort of headcount. If workloads are high, deadlines can't be reduced, and on the other question, we're a small business, what can we do to protect employee well-being short term, and also how can that relate to potentially having low cost implications to the business?
Yeah, look, I mean, a small business or a PE-backed business, you in order to meet your commercial objectives, you have to be lean, right? And I totally get that. My biggest piece of advice here, it would be to upskill yourself on org efficiency and design. It means that you can then become that consultant with your business to start to look at the workflows and processes within each of the departments. So if you haven't got an operating model that's set up yet, you are not too small to have an operating model. And the sooner you do this, the more clarity that it can provide everyone. So your operating model should be looking at your tech stack, your talent framework, your org design. It's multifaceted, and if you're happy to reach out, if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can help you. But what that can do without spending a fortune of money is look at how your organization is operating, looking at each component, who's responsible for the input and output of each team. And then also you're then saying, okay, there's a lot of administrative processes going on here that 5 of my senior leaders are managing. Is there a piece of tech that can automate that? Can someone build something really clever in Power BI or in Excel that can start to automate the way that is working? Is there a centralized way that we can do this? Is there a standardized way that we can do this? And it really helps if you start to zero base your organization. So zero base, build the dream. So Disney model, build your Disney model without any constraints. Then apply a lens of reality, and then criticize it. And then you can start to build something that you can then start to aim for and work with your business leader to implement. And that doesn't have to cost any money. It does cost time, I will say, and it costs your time, right? Because you are the consultant with your business leader and you are walking them through how to, I suppose, pull apart and rebuild that operating model. But what you'll have at the end of it is a leaner, more efficient operating model where everyone knows what their responsibility is, what they're delivering, and what's coming into them. They know their KPIs, they know their measures, and also the administrative or the operational burden from your leaders or from your senior ICs has been relieved and moved to either more appropriate resource or it's been automated by a piece of technology. That would be my direction that I would go to.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, doesn't have to cost the world, right? But it's a small proportion of time for Disney thinking. That's today's webinar. Thank you very much. Amy, thank you for your time and thank you for your insights today. Just move forward to wrapping up. If you want to find out more from us, some of you will have your phone handy to take a QR code. That'll be great, and that'll take you through to a contact us page. But we will also follow up today with a bit of a thanks and a summary of the recording, etc. as well. We do always encourage you to like and subscribe. I think this is what my son's going to tell me to say, but to follow us and to follow our channels on LinkedIn, where there's always some good insight being shared. Feel free to connect with Amy. Like she mentioned earlier, if you really want to laugh, feel free to connect with me. And yes, as I said, thank you for joining us. We hope that for those that took part in the poll right at the start, you've made sort of that forward momentum move to understanding more about how you can approach burnout in your organisation and make some changes, or really, if change is not needed, just to understand more about the impact of the workforce and how strategically placed HR as an organisation or as a team are placed to drive organisational change and help the workforce. So with that, thank you very much. We appreciate it. The recording will be shared with you, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.